The chamber went silent the moment Daniel Hart placed his hand flat on the table and stopped speaking. I remember thinking that silence from a human was somehow louder than any shout I had ever heard from any other species in my long career. My name is Voss Karen, and on that day I was serving as the third attaché of the Concord Diplomatic Office, seated 2 chairs down from Counselor Reth Amara, watching a conversation that would later be studied in every academy across 100 worlds. We were 40 minutes into the session. The topic on the table was the Coran Expanse, a cluster of systems rich in rare minerals that the Concord had claimed under old charter law, and that humanity had quietly settled without asking anyone's permission first. This was, according to every briefing I had read the night before, a simple matter. Humanity was young. 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 I want to be honest about that, because everything that follows makes more sense if you understand how confident we were at the start. Counselor Amara opened with the standard greeting, the one used for lesser powers being invited to a negotiation rather than being summoned to one. She thanked the human delegation for traveling such a distance, praised their species for its rapid technological growth, and then moved directly into the demand, wrapped in language soft enough to sound like a suggestion. The Coran Expanse would be returned to Concord administration. In exchange, humanity would receive trade rights in 3 neighboring systems, along with formal recognition as an associate member of the Concord, a status that came with protections many young species spent centuries trying to earn. I watched the human delegation as she spoke. There were 4 of them. Daniel Hart sat at the center, a tall man with tired eyes and hands that never seemed to stop moving slightly, tapping some private rhythm against his knee. To his left sat Laura Bennett, introduced to us only as a fleet liaison, though something about the way she held herself told me she was far more than that. To his right sat 2 younger aides, both quiet, both watching everything, with the particular stillness of people who have been told to say nothing unless spoken to directly. When Counselor Amara finished, there was a pause, not a long one, perhaps 4 seconds, but I noted it, because in every previous negotiation I had attended, a demand like that was met with an immediate counteroffer, a plea for more time, or at the very least a polite objection. Daniel Hart offered none of these things. He simply looked at the counselor for those 4 seconds, and then he asked a question that I did not expect. He asked her to define the word peace as the Concord understood it. It seemed like such a strange thing to ask in the middle of a resource negotiation. Counselor Amara laughed softly, the kind of laugh diplomats use when they are buying time, and she gave the standard answer, the one written into the founding charter 3,000 years ago. Peace, she said, is the absence of conflict between member worlds, maintained through fair distribution of resources and mutual respect for territorial boundaries established by lawful precedent. Daniel Hart nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly that answer, and found it disappointing rather than surprising. Then he said something that I wrote down word for word in my personal notes that night, because even in the moment I understood, it mattered. He said that where he came from, peace was not the absence of conflict. Peace was the presence of trust. And trust, he said, was something the Concord had not yet earned from his people. Not because of anything said in that room, but because of things that had already happened in the Coran Expanse before this meeting ever began. I did not know, at that time, what he was referring to. I would learn later, but in that room, in that moment, I only saw the temperature of the negotiation change. Counselor Amara's aide leaned over and whispered something to her. Her posture straightened, and for the first time since I had joined the diplomatic office, I saw a Concord counselor look genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. She asked him to clarify what he meant by things that had already happened. Daniel Hart did not answer immediately. Instead, Laura Bennett reached into a small case beside her chair and placed a single data crystal on the table. She did not explain what was on it. She simply slid it toward the center of the table, the universal gesture across 100 cultures, for here is the truth, look at it yourself. Counselor Amara's aide picked it up and inserted it into the reader built into the table's surface. What appeared above the table was a series of sensor logs, timestamps, and coordinates. I recognized the format instantly, because it matched Concord military reporting standards almost exactly, which told me immediately that this had been retrieved rather than created, pulled from somewhere it was never meant to leave. The logs showed a patrol vessel, registered to the Concord's 3rd Border Fleet, entering a system inside the Coran Expanse that had been settled by a human agricultural colony 11 months earlier. The logs showed the vessel's sensors sweeping the colony's surface structures in a pattern that any trained officer would recognize as a targeting sequence rather than a survey pattern. The logs ended abruptly, cutting off mid-transmission, exactly the way records tend to end when someone decides afterward that they should not exist. I felt the air in the room shift. Counselor Amara looked at her aide, and her aide looked back at her with an expression that told me neither of them had known this record existed, or if they had known, they had believed it buried deeply enough that it never would surface in a room like this one. Daniel Hart spoke again, quietly, without any anger in his voice, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. He said that 11 months ago, a Concorde vessel had scanned a colony of 600 civilians using targeting protocols, and that no explanation had ever been offered, no apology had ever been sent, and no one on that vessel had ever been held accountable, because as far as the colony's own government could determine, nobody outside a small circle within the 3rd Border Fleet had ever been told the incident occurred at all. He said his government had chosen not to make this public, not yet. He said they had come to this meeting today hoping to have a real conversation, one built on the honesty that peace actually requires, rather than one built on soft language, designed to make an old claim sound reasonable. I glanced at Counselor Amara. I had served under her for 6 years, and I had never once seen her lose control of a room. But in that moment, she was no longer controlling anything. She was reacting. She began speaking quickly, explaining that the incident, if it had occurred, would have been the action of a single rogue commander, unauthorized and unrepresentative of Concorde policy, and that a full investigation would be launched immediately. Daniel Hart listened to all of this with the same patient, unreadable expression he had worn since the meeting began. When she finished, he simply said that his government did not doubt her sincerity. What his government doubted was the Concorde structure itself, a structure old enough and large enough that incidents like this one could happen and disappear without ever reaching the people meant to be accountable for them. Then he said the sentence that I still remember most clearly of everything spoken that day. He said that a civilization which cannot see its own mistakes clearly enough to prevent them from repeating is not a civilization equipped to decide what peace means for anyone else. The room went silent again, not the tense silence of the opening, but something heavier, the silence of people realizing that the meeting they had walked into was not the meeting they thought they were attending. Counselor Amara tried to recover. She proposed a recess, framed as a courtesy to allow both delegations to consult privately before continuing. I could see in her eyes that she needed the recess far more than the humans did. Daniel Hart agreed without hesitation, and the 2 delegations rose from the table at the same time, though the energy in each group could not have been more different. The Concorde side moved quickly, murmuring to each other, already assembling a response strategy. The human side moved slowly, calmly, almost as if the outcome of the recess had already been decided before it began. I was asked to remain in the outer chamber while the senior counselors convened privately, and it was there that I first spoke with Laura Bennett, who had stepped out into the corridor rather than join the private strategy session her own delegation was having down the hall. She stood near the observation window that looked out over the docking platform, where the human transport ship sat alone among a dozen larger Concorde vessels, small and unremarkable in every visible way. I asked her, carefully, whether the incident Daniel Hart described was truly unknown to the wider Concorde leadership before today. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, the kind of look that measures whether a question is being asked out of genuine curiosity or out of the reflex to defend one's own side. She said that was exactly the question her government wanted the Concorde to ask itself. Not whether the incident was known, but why a structure with as much power as the Concorde held could allow something like it to remain unknown for 11 months in the first place. I did not have an answer for her. I still do not fully have one, even now, looking back on everything that happened after. What struck me most, standing there in that corridor, was how little threat there was in anything she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture toward the ships outside. She spoke the way someone speaks when they are simply describing a fact about the world, a fact they expect the listener to eventually understand whether they want to or not. I asked her what her government intended to do if the recess did not produce a satisfactory resolution. She was quiet for a moment, watching the small human transport ship through the window, and then she said something that I did not understand the full weight of until much later. She said her government did not intend to do anything dramatic. She said humanity had learned, over a shorter history than most species in the Concord, that the loudest response is rarely the most effective one. She said if the talks failed, her people would simply go home and wait. I asked her what they would be waiting for. She turned from the window and looked at me directly, and for the first time in the conversation, something in her expression shifted, not into anger, but into something colder and more certain. She said they would be waiting to see whether the Concord was capable of changing, or whether it would simply continue behaving the way it always had, secure in the belief that no consequence would ever reach far enough to matter. Then she excused herself and walked back down the corridor to rejoin her delegation, leaving me standing alone by the window, watching that small, unremarkable ship sitting quietly among giants, and feeling, for reasons I could not yet explain, a growing sense that everything I understood about the balance of power in this galaxy was about to be tested in a way none of us were prepared for. The recess was scheduled to last 2 hours. I did not know it then, but those 2 hours would be the last calm moments the Concord would experience for a very long time. The 2 hours passed slower than any 2 hours I had experienced in my career. I spent most of them in the observation gallery above the main chamber, reviewing the sensor logs Laura Bennett's delegation had presented, cross-referencing timestamps against the 3rd Border Fleet's official patrol schedules. Everything matched. There was no error in the data, no gap that could be explained away as fabrication. Whatever had happened in that system 11 months earlier, it had happened exactly as the humans described it. When the delegations returned to the chamber, the mood had changed completely. Counselor Amara no longer opened with the soft, practiced warmth she had used at the start of the session. She opened instead with an apology, formal and measured, acknowledging that an incident matching the human delegation's account had indeed occurred, and that a review board would be convened to determine responsibility. She called it a serious breach of protocol. She called it deeply regrettable. Daniel Hart accepted the apology with a simple nod, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that the negotiation might still find its footing. That hope did not last long. Counselor Amara continued, and it became clear very quickly that the apology was meant to close the subject, rather than open a new conversation. She returned almost immediately to the original demand, restating the Concord's position on the Coran expanse as though the previous hour had never happened. The territory belonged, by charter law, to the Concord. Humanity's presence there, however peaceful, was technically unauthorized. The apology for the scanning incident was offered freely and sincerely, she said, but it did not change the underlying legal reality of the dispute. I watched Daniel Hart's face as she spoke, and I saw something settle behind his eyes. Not surprise, but confirmation of something he had already suspected walking into the room. He asked her directly whether the Concord intended to treat the apology as separate from the territorial question, as though one incident of misconduct could be resolved with words, while the demand connected to that same territory continued forward unchanged. Counselor Amara said that was, in essence, correct. The Concord regretted the incident. The Concord still required the return of the Coran expanse. It was at this point that the Concord military attaché, a broad-shouldered officer named Fleet Marshal Osirian Crael, stood and addressed the chamber directly, something unusual for a session still technically in the diplomatic phase. He said that the Concord's patience with this matter had limits, and that humanity's continued occupation of territory it held no legal claim to was, in itself, a provocation that could not continue indefinitely. He said the 3rd Border Fleet stood ready to enforce whatever resolution the Council decided upon, and he said this while looking directly at Daniel Hart, in a manner clearly intended to be understood as a warning. I remember thinking, even then, that this was a mistake, not because the threat itself was unusual. Concord negotiations often included this kind of posturing, a reminder of strength, meant to bring a smaller delegation back in line. I had seen it work 100 times with other species who understood implicitly that the Concorde's combined fleets outnumbered anything a single young civilization could hope to assemble. But I had also spent the last 2 hours reading about an incident where a Concorde patrol vessel had aimed targeting sensors at 600 civilians and then quietly erased the record of doing so. And I understood, watching Daniel Hart's expression remain perfectly calm under Fleet Marshal Crael's warning, that whatever effect this kind of threat was supposed to have, it was not having it. Daniel Hart waited until Fleet Marshal Crael sat back down before he spoke. He said that he understood the Concorde's position, and that he respected the Fleet Marshal's willingness to state it plainly, rather than hide it behind diplomatic phrasing. He said his government appreciated honesty, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. Then he asked a single question, one that I did not understand the significance of until much later, when I had time to study human military history in far greater depth than my initial briefings had provided. He asked Fleet Marshal Crael how many ships the Third Border Fleet currently had stationed within 3 jumps of the Coran Expanse. The Fleet Marshal hesitated, clearly recognizing that this information was not something typically shared during negotiations, but Counselor Amara, perhaps hoping to demonstrate the Concorde's overwhelming strength as a form of pressure, instructed him to answer. He stated the number. It was substantial, more than enough to overwhelm anything humanity's young fleet could realistically assemble in response, and I saw several members of the Concorde delegation exchange satisfied glances, believing this number alone might be enough to end the conversation in their favor. Daniel Hart simply nodded and thanked him for the information. He did not react with concern. He did not react with defiance. He reacted the way someone reacts when a fact they already suspected is finally confirmed aloud. He then asked Counselor Amara for a final clarification before the session concluded. He asked whether the Concorde's position, stripped of all diplomatic language, amounted to this: that despite acknowledging misconduct against human civilians, the Concorde still intended to use its military advantage to compel humanity to surrender territory it had settled peacefully, and that failure to comply would be treated as a provocation justifying further action. Counselor Amara paused before answering, and I could see in her hesitation that she understood exactly how the question had been constructed, and how dangerous it would be to answer it honestly. But there was no way to avoid it without appearing evasive in front of the full chamber, so she answered as diplomatically as she could, which still amounted to a confirmation of everything Daniel Hart had just described. He thanked her for her clarity. Then he said something that I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count since that day. He said his government did not intend to fight the Concorde over the Coran Expanse. He said his government did not believe fighting was necessary to resolve this matter, and that any suggestion of military escalation, from either side, would be treated by humanity as an unnecessary and unwelcome path. For a moment, the entire chamber seemed to relax, believing this to be the beginning of a genuine offer of surrender, or at least compromise. Then he continued, and the relief in the room evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. He said that his government's response to today's meeting would not be a fleet buildup, and it would not be a formal declaration of anything. He said his government's response would be quieter than that, and he asked the chamber to understand that quiet, coming from his people, should never be mistaken for weakness or retreat. Fleet Marshal Crael asked him directly what that meant in practical terms. Daniel Hart looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said that humanity had learned, through a history far more violent than most species in this galaxy could imagine, that the civilizations which survive their own worst mistakes are not the ones who react the fastest, or the loudest, or the most aggressively. He said they are the ones who understand exactly how much force is necessary, apply it with total precision, and then stop. He said the Concorde had spent today demonstrating, through both words and actions, that it did not yet understand the difference between strength and restraint. He said his government hoped, sincerely, that this would change. But he said hope was not a plan, and his government did not intend to leave humanity's future safety dependent on the Concorde's hope to improve. Counselor Amara asked him, with noticeable tension in her voice, whether this was a threat. Daniel Hart said no. He said it was a warning, and there was a difference. A threat, he said, describes something someone intends to do to force a desired outcome. A warning describes something that will happen regardless of what anyone in this room decides. because it has already been set into motion by choices made before today's meeting even began. I did not understand, in that moment, what he meant by choices already made. I would understand within days. He requested that the session be formally closed, stating that his delegation had heard everything it needed to hear, and that further discussion would not change the fundamental position either side had already stated clearly. Counselor Amara, visibly unsettled but unwilling to appear weak in front of the full chamber, agreed to close the session, framing it as a mutual decision to allow both governments time to reflect. As the human delegation rose to leave, Laura Bennett paused near the doorway and looked back at the chamber one final time. Her eyes moved across the assembled counselors, the fleet officers, the aides still frantically taking notes, and finally settled briefly on me, seated in the observation gallery above. I do not know why she looked at me specifically. Perhaps it was simply chance. But in that brief moment, I felt something I had never felt in 6 years of diplomatic service. A feeling I can only describe now as the sensation of watching a door close on an era, without yet understanding what era was beginning on the other side of it. The human delegation departed without further incident. Fleet Marshal Crail immediately convened his senior officers to discuss enforcement contingencies. Counselor Amara retreated to her private office, and I was informed later that she remained there for several hours without seeing anyone. I returned to my own quarters that night and reviewed every recording I had access to from the session, trying to understand what I had witnessed. It did not feel like the end of a failed negotiation. It felt like the closing statement of a trial, delivered calmly by a party who already knew the verdict and had simply been waiting for the room to catch up. I did not sleep well that night. I do not think anyone who attended that session did. 3 days after the negotiation ended, I was summoned to a briefing room I had never been assigned to before, deep within the administrative wing of the Concord Central Station. Fleet Marshal Crail had requested my presence directly, which surprised me, since attaches of my rank were rarely included in military planning sessions. I understood why once I arrived and saw the display hovering above the central table. It showed the last known positions of every human vessel that had been operating within Concord monitored space over the previous month. There had been 31 such vessels, a mix of transport ships, small patrol craft, and a handful of larger support vessels stationed near the human colonies in the Coran Expanse. According to the display, 28 of those 31 vessels had left Concord monitored space entirely within the past 72 hours. Fleet Marshal Crail asked me, since I had studied human behavior more closely than most of his own staff, to explain what I thought this meant. I told him honestly that I did not know, but that it did not resemble any pattern of military mobilization I had ever studied. A withdrawal like this made no tactical sense if the goal was to prepare for confrontation. If anything, it looked like the opposite of aggression. It looked like retreat. One of the younger officers in the room suggested this, confirmed the Concord's strength had been enough to discourage further conflict without need for direct action. Fleet Marshal Crail did not look convinced, and neither was I. I had been present in that chamber 3 days earlier. I had watched Daniel Hart's face when Fleet Marshal Crail listed the size of the Third Border Fleet. There had been no fear in his expression. There had only been calculation. I raised a concern, carefully, choosing my words with more caution than I usually needed in these rooms. I said that in my assessment, withdrawal following a failed negotiation was not necessarily a sign of weakness or surrender. I reminded the room that Daniel Hart had specifically used the word warning rather than threat, and that he had described something already set into motion before the meeting had even taken place. I suggested that this withdrawal might not be retreat at all, but preparation for something we did not yet have visibility into. Fleet Marshal Crail dismissed this concern more quickly than I expected, stating that humanity's fleet, even fully assembled, remained a fraction of the size of the Third Border Fleet alone, and that no rational military strategist would choose to withdraw entirely from contested territory unless attempting to avoid a conflict they knew they could not win. He ordered increased monitoring of the Coran Expanse border, but declined to escalate the Concord's own military posture, citing budget constraints and a desire not to appear as the aggressor should the withdrawal indicate a genuine desire for peace. I left that meeting with a feeling I could not fully articulate at the time, a sense that the entire Concord military leadership was reading a set of facts correctly while drawing entirely the wrong conclusion from them. Over the following 2 weeks, I made it my personal project, unofficial, and largely unsupervised, to track every scrap of information available about human activity following the withdrawal. This was more difficult than it should have been. Human communication networks, I discovered, were remarkably difficult for Concord's signal intelligence to penetrate, not because they used more advanced encryption in any single layer, but because their systems changed structure constantly, in patterns that seemed almost designed to frustrate long-term surveillance, rather than resist any single intercepted transmission. What little information I could gather painted a picture that unsettled me more the longer I studied it. Human colonies throughout the Coran expanse and neighboring systems were not evacuating, as one might expect if preparing for imminent conflict. They were instead undergoing what appeared to be quiet, methodical reinforcement. Supply shipments increased. Civilian populations in border settlements were relocated further from the disputed boundary, but not withdrawn from the region entirely. Communication traffic between human systems increased dramatically, while communication traffic between human systems and any external Concord-monitored network dropped to almost nothing. It was during this period that I began speaking regularly with a junior signals analyst named Thomas Bright, who had been assigned to monitor human frequency patterns as part of the increased border surveillance Fleet Marshal Crail had authorized. Thomas was younger than most officers in his position, sharp-minded, and increasingly frustrated by how little support his section was receiving, despite what he considered deeply concerning findings. He showed me, during one of our informal conversations, a pattern he had noticed in human shipping manifests intercepted near the border. The manifests themselves were mundane, listing standard cargo categories used across most trade routes. But the volume and destination pattern told a different story. Certain categories of cargo, categories associated with heavy industrial construction and long-range logistics support, were flowing steadily toward a small cluster of systems near the edge of human-controlled space. Systems that, according to every record the Concorde possessed, held no significant population or strategic value. Thomas believed something was being constructed there. He could not determine what, since human sensor shielding around those systems had become nearly impenetrable in the weeks following the failed negotiation. He had submitted 3 separate reports up his chain of command, requesting additional reconnaissance assets to investigate further. All 3 requests had been denied, on the grounds that resources were better allocated toward monitoring the immediate border, rather than speculative construction projects deep within uncontested human territory. I found this troubling, for reasons that went beyond simple military concern. It reflected something I was beginning to understand about the Concorde as an institution, something I had perhaps always known, but never allowed myself to examine directly. We were an old civilization, built on structures and assumptions that had gone unchallenged for so long that we had stopped questioning whether they were still accurate. We assumed that strength could be measured in ship counts and territory held. We assumed that patience from a smaller power indicated weakness rather than strategy. We assumed, above all, that we understood the shape of every threat we might ever face, simply because we had faced so many threats before and survived them all. Humanity did not fit neatly into any of these assumptions, and rather than adjusting our thinking to account for that, we had simply continued applying the old framework and hoping it would eventually prove correct. I brought my concerns, along with Thomas Bright's findings, to Counselor Amara directly, requesting a private audience outside the formal channels that had so far failed to produce any meaningful response. She agreed to see me, though I could tell from the moment I entered her office that the past 2 weeks had worn on her more heavily than she wanted to admit publicly. I laid out everything I had gathered, the withdrawal pattern, the quiet industrial buildup near the human border, the near-total collapse of Concorde's signal intelligence capability within human-controlled space. I told her plainly that I believed we were misreading the situation, and that whatever humanity was preparing, it was almost certainly not the passive, defensive posture our military leadership had assumed it to be. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. She told me that she had reached similar conclusions on her own, though she had lacked the specific intelligence I had just presented to her. She said that in the days since the failed negotiation, she had reviewed the full historical record on humanity that the Concorde's archives possessed, something she admitted she should have done far more thoroughly before ever sitting down at that negotiating table. What she found troubled her deeply. Human history, she explained, was defined by a pattern that repeated across centuries and continents long before humanity ever left its home planet. Periods of apparent internal division and weakness were consistently followed by sudden, decisive consolidation whenever an external threat crossed a line their society considered unacceptable. And once that consolidation occurred, humanity's capacity to adapt, innovate, and apply overwhelming, precisely targeted force in response had a track record that, in her words, made the Third Border Fleet's numerical advantage feel far less reassuring than it had 3 weeks earlier. She told me she had tried, quietly, to raise these concerns with the High Council, and had been met with the same dismissiveness Fleet Marshal Kryl had shown toward my own warnings. The Council, she said, was operating under the assumption that humanity, lacking the deep space infrastructure and centuries of interstellar experience that most Concord member species possessed, simply could not pose a credible threat, regardless of how their behavior appeared on paper. I asked her what she believed we should do. She said the only thing she believed might still work was to reopen communication, quietly, outside official channels, before the situation escalated further. She asked me, given the rapport I seemed to have built with the human delegation during the negotiation, whether I would be willing to attempt exactly that. I agreed, though I did not yet know how difficult that task would prove to be, or how little time we actually had left before the question of what humanity was building near their border stopped being a mystery and became something the entire galaxy would witness firsthand. Reopening communication with humanity proved far more difficult than I had anticipated. I sent 3 separate messages through the diplomatic channel that had been used to arrange the original negotiation, addressed personally to Daniel Hart, requesting a private conversation outside the formal Concord structure. All 3 messages went unanswered for over a week, and I began to suspect that whatever process had been set into motion following the failed talks had already progressed too far for casual diplomacy to interrupt it. I was wrong, though only barely. On the 9th day, I received a short reply, not from Daniel Hart directly, but from Laura Bennett. It contained only a set of coordinates, a time, and a single sentence stating that she would speak with me, but only me, and only in person, aboard a small unmarked transport that would meet my shuttle at the designated location. I did not inform Counselor Amara of the specific details before I left, partly out of caution, and partly, I admit now, out of a growing personal need to understand what was happening for my own sake, rather than purely for the benefit of my government. I took a single Concord shuttle, unarmed and unescorted, to the coordinates provided, which turned out to be a quiet stretch of open space along the outer edge of a system neither side claimed any strong interest in. Laura Bennett's transport arrived precisely on time, and I was permitted aboard alone. The interior of the ship was smaller than I expected, sparse and functional, nothing like the elaborate diplomatic vessels the Concord typically used for sensitive meetings. She met me in a narrow room near the airlock, offered me something warm to drink that I did not recognize but accepted out of courtesy, and sat across from me without any of the formal posturing that had characterized every previous interaction between our peoples. I asked her directly what humanity was building near the edge of their controlled space. She did not pretend not to understand the question, which I appreciated, even as her honesty unsettled me further. She said she could not tell me the specific details, but she could tell me the purpose behind it, if I was willing to listen without immediately reporting everything back to Fleet Marshal Krayel's office. I told her I was there precisely because I believed Fleet Marshal Krayel was not listening to warnings at all, regardless of source, and that I hoped a clearer understanding might help Counselor Amara find a way to prevent whatever was coming before it became unavoidable. She studied me for a long moment, the way someone studies another person when deciding how much trust to extend to them, and then she began speaking. She told me that after the failed negotiation, her government had reached a conclusion that troubled them more deeply than the original territorial dispute ever had. It was not simply that a Concord vessel had aimed weapons sensors at a civilian colony. It was that the incident had been buried for 11 months by an organization large enough and old enough that such incidents could disappear entirely, without any single individual ever being forced to answer for them. She said her government did not believe the Concord was evil, or malicious, or even particularly unusual among galactic powers. She said the problem was structural. The Concord had grown so large, so old, and so confident in its own institutional processes that accountability had become theoretical rather than actual. She said humanity had faced a version of this problem in its own history, more than once, and had learned through painful experience that institutions left unchecked for too long eventually stopped protecting the people they claimed to serve, and started protecting themselves instead. She said her government's response to the failed negotiation was not built around the Coran expanse at all. Not really. It was built around a single question they intended to answer for themselves, regardless of how the Concord felt about it. The question, she said, was whether humanity could exist within reach of a power like the Concord, without being permanently vulnerable to exactly the kind of quiet, unaccountable harm that had already happened once, and could easily happen again. I asked her what answer they had reached. She said her government had concluded that the only way to guarantee their own safety was to ensure that any future action taken against them, by the Concord or by anyone else, would carry a cost so precise and so certain that no rational actor would ever consider it again. Not a war, not a fleet built to conquer or destroy. A single, unmistakable demonstration of consequence, delivered once, calibrated exactly to the scale of what had been done to them, so that the message could never be dismissed as bluster or misread as weakness. I felt a chill move through me as she spoke, not because of any specific threat in her words, but because of the calm, almost clinical certainty with which she described something that any Concord strategist would have framed in the language of retaliation, escalation, or war. She was describing none of those things. She was describing a controlled, deliberate answer to a question her people needed answered, for their own peace of mind, regardless of what the Concord did or did not do in response. I asked her whether there was still time to prevent whatever was being prepared, whether an apology from the council, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an offer of genuine reform, might change the outcome. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried something that was not quite sadness, but was close to it. She said that an apology might have mattered 3 weeks earlier, before the withdrawal, before the build-up, before the decision had already been made and set irreversibly into motion. She said humanity did not make threats lightly, and once a course had been chosen, reversing it required more than words spoken after the fact. She said this was not cruelty. It was consistency. The same consistency her government expected from any institution it dealt with, including its own. I asked her, finally, whether what was coming would harm innocent people, whether civilians, whether anyone beyond those directly responsible for the incident, would suffer because of what her government intended to do. She looked at me directly when she answered, and I believed her completely. She said her government's entire approach had been built specifically to avoid that outcome. She said the goal was never to cause suffering broadly, or to punish an entire civilization for the actions of a single patrol vessel and the institution that had hidden it. The goal was precision, a response calibrated exactly to the structures responsible, delivered in a way that would be impossible to misunderstand, and impossible to spread blame away from where it actually belonged. I did not fully understand what that meant in practical terms, not yet. But I left that meeting with a clearer picture than I had possessed before, and a growing certainty that time had nearly run out for anyone within the Concord who still hoped this could be resolved through ordinary diplomatic means. I returned to Concord space and requested an immediate audience with Counselor Amara, carrying with me everything Laura Bennett had shared. I did not know, as I traveled back, that within days, the silence surrounding humanity's activities would end, and the entire galaxy would finally understand exactly what had been built, quietly, patiently, in the systems no one had thought to watch closely enough. I reported everything to Counselor Amara within hours of returning, and to her credit, she acted immediately, calling an emergency session of the High Council despite the late hour, and the certainty that several members would resent being summoned without warning. I was permitted to attend as a witness, though not to speak unless directly questioned, and I sat in the gallery once again, watching a room full of powerful people argue about a threat most of them still did not fully believe existed. Fleet Marshal Crail dismissed my second-hand account almost immediately, pointing out, not unreasonably, that I had no verified intelligence, only the word of a single human official, speaking in vague, almost philosophical terms about consequence and precision. Several counselors agreed with him, arguing that humanity's withdrawal and subsequent silence was far more likely to indicate an internal political struggle, perhaps even instability within their own government, than any coordinated plan. Counselor Amara argued forcefully against this interpretation, citing the buried incident, the buildup near the human border, and the collapse of Concord's signal intelligence within human space as evidence that something significant was underway. But without concrete proof of what that something actually was, her warnings carried less weight than they should have, and the session ended without any meaningful change in Concord posture. Fleet Marshal Cryell agreed only to increase patrol frequency along the Corin Expanse border, a concession that felt, even to me, dangerously insufficient, given everything I had learned. I left that session with a heavy, unsettled feeling that stayed with me for the following several days. I did not have to wait long to understand exactly how insufficient our response had been. It was early in the ship's cycle, 4 days after the emergency session, when the alert came through every monitoring station along the Corin Expanse border simultaneously. A single vessel had entered the disputed system, appearing without any prior warning on long-range sensors, as though it had simply chosen the moment it wished to be seen, rather than the moment it actually arrived. I was in Counselor Amara's office when the report reached us, and I watched her face as the details scrolled across her display. A single human vessel, far larger than anything our intelligence had previously catalogued for their fleet, had taken up a stationary position at the edge of the system, well within range of the very infrastructure the Third Border Fleet used to monitor and enforce the Concord's claim over the region, yet making no aggressive movement whatsoever. Fleet Marshal Cryell's response was immediate and, in hindsight, deeply revealing of exactly the mistake I had been warning about for weeks. He interpreted the single vessel not as a demonstration of overwhelming capability, but as an opportunity, a chance to intercept and neutralize what he assumed must be an isolated, perhaps malfunctioning or lost, human ship before it could cause any real disruption. He ordered a full response wing from the Third Border Fleet, 12 vessels strong, to intercept and demand the human ship's immediate withdrawal or surrender. I was granted permission, largely because Counselor Amara insisted on it, to observe the encounter remotely from a secondary command post, alongside a handful of senior officers monitoring live sensor feeds from the approaching Concord wing. I remember the atmosphere in that room shifting from confident anticipation to quiet unease within the span of only a few minutes, as the 12 Concord vessels drew close enough for detailed scans of the human ship to finally register. The vessel's design bore almost no resemblance to anything in our existing records of human shipbuilding. It was larger, its hull structure denser, and its energy signature steady and enormous in a way that made several officers in the room visibly straighten in their seats. Yet still, it made no aggressive movement. It did not power weapons systems. It did not attempt evasive maneuvers. It simply sat, patient and immovable, at the exact edge of the system boundary, as though waiting for something specific to happen before it would act at all. The Concord Wing Commander opened a communication channel, demanding identification and immediate withdrawal, citing the ongoing territorial dispute and the Concord's established claim over the system. There was a pause of nearly 30 seconds before any response came, a pause that felt, even through the second-hand sensor feed I was watching, unbearably long. When the response finally arrived, it was not spoken by anyone I recognized. A calm, measured voice identified the vessel only by a designation, gave no name, and stated plainly that the ship was present to observe compliance with terms already communicated to Concord leadership through official channels weeks earlier. When the wing commander demanded clarification on what terms were being referenced, the voice stated simply that the terms had been outlined during the failed negotiation, and that the Concord's continued military presence within the Corin Expanse, despite the acknowledged misconduct against a human civilian population, constituted an ongoing violation those terms were meant to address. I watched Fleet Marshal Cryell's expression through a secondary feed from the command deck, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen there before across the entire course of this crisis. Not confidence, not calculation, something closer to the beginning of genuine doubt. He ordered the wing commander to proceed with a show of force, positioning the 12 Concord vessels in a standard intimidation formation around the single human ship, weapons armed but not yet fired, intended to communicate overwhelming numerical superiority and compel the vessel to withdraw without requiring any actual engagement. The human vessel did not react to this formation at all. It did not power additional systems. It did not attempt to reposition. It remained exactly where it had been since its arrival, and the voice on the open channel spoke once more, stating, without any detectable change in tone, that the Concorde had 36 hours to begin a full withdrawal of military assets from the Coran expanse, along with a public acknowledgement of the incident that had prompted this response, or the vessel would proceed with actions already authorized by human leadership prior to its arrival. Fleet Marshal Creel demanded to know what those actions were. The channel closed without any further reply. I remember the silence that followed in that command post more vividly than almost anything else from that entire period. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. Officers who had spent weeks dismissing every warning I had raised now sat staring at the single, unmoving vessel on their displays, 12 of our own ships arrayed uselessly around it, as though numbers alone had ever been the thing that mattered. Counselor Amara turned to me and asked, quietly, whether I believed the 36-hour deadline was genuine, or simply another piece of the calculated pressure Laura Bennett had described to me weeks earlier. I told her honestly that I did not know, but that everything I had learned about humanity over the past several weeks suggested that when they stated a number, that number tended to mean exactly what it said, and nothing more or less than that. Fleet Marshal Creel, still unwilling to fully accept what was unfolding in front of him, ordered his wing commander to maintain position and continue monitoring the human vessel, while he convened an emergency session with the High Council to determine an official response to the ultimatum. I do not believe, even in that moment, that he truly understood how little time remained for deliberation, or how completely the balance of power in that system had already shifted, whether the Concorde chose to acknowledge it or not. 36 hours. That was all the time we had left, and as the countdown began, I found myself hoping, more desperately than I had hoped for anything in my entire career, that someone within the Concorde leadership would finally choose to listen before that time ran out. The 36 hours that followed felt longer than any stretch of time I had experienced in my entire life. The High Council convened twice during that window, both sessions ending in the same fractured disagreement that had characterized every previous discussion of the human situation. Fleet Marshal Creel argued for a preemptive strike against the single vessel, insisting that allowing it to remain unchallenged would signal weakness to every other species watching the Coran Expanse dispute unfold. Counselor Amara argued just as forcefully for compliance, pointing out that the demand itself, a withdrawal of unauthorized military assets, and a public acknowledgement of confirmed misconduct, was not an unreasonable one, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be to accept it under pressure. The Council failed to reach a unified decision before the deadline arrived. In the absence of clear direction, Fleet Marshal Creel made the choice himself, authorizing a limited strike intended to disable the human vessel's weapons systems without, in his own words, escalating toward full destruction. I do not believe he ever truly expected the situation to progress beyond that point. I believe, even then, he still saw this as a demonstration meant to reassert Concorde authority, rather than a genuine turning point in galactic history. I was present in the secondary command post when the order was given, and I watched as 3 Concorde vessels from the response wing moved to engage the human ship at the exact moment the deadline expired. What happened next unfolded faster than my mind could fully process it in real time, and it was only in reviewing the recorded sensor data afterward that I began to understand the true shape of what we had witnessed. The human vessel did not retreat, and it did not hesitate. In the span of less than 4 minutes, it disabled all 3 attacking Concorde ships without destroying a single one of them, targeting propulsion and weapons systems with a precision that left every crew member aboard those vessels alive and largely unharmed, but completely unable to continue any offensive action. The remaining 9 vessels in the response wing, watching this unfold, held position rather than engaging further, and Fleet Marshal Creel, according to the recordings I later reviewed, gave no order to continue the attack. What the human vessel did next was, in some ways, more unsettling than the engagement itself. Rather than pressing any advantage, rather than moving to threaten the remaining Concorde ships, or the border installations behind them, it simply returned to its original position at the edge of the system and resumed its earlier stillness, as though the entire engagement had been nothing more than a necessary demonstration, rather than the opening move of a larger conflict. The voice returned on the open channel moments later, calm and unchanged from before, stating that the 36-hour deadline had passed without compliance. and that the demonstration just witnessed represented the minimum level of response humanity was prepared to escalate to, should further non-compliance occur. It stated, plainly, that the 3 disabled vessels and their crews would not be harmed further, and that repair assistance would be offered if requested, an offer that struck everyone in that command post as almost surreally courteous given what had just occurred. Then the voice made a final statement, one that I believe, more than anything else that happened during that entire crisis, changed the way the wider galaxy would come to understand humanity from that point forward. It said that humanity had no interest in destroying the Concorde, no ambition to expand beyond what was necessary for their own safety, and no desire to be seen as a threat to any civilization that did not first choose to threaten them. It said the demonstration that had just occurred was not an act of aggression, but an answer to a question the Concorde's own actions had asked, 11 months earlier, when a patrol vessel aimed its sensors at 600 civilians, and the incident vanished quietly into institutional silence. It said the Concorde now understood, with total clarity, exactly what consequence looked like when humanity chose to apply it, and it said that understanding, once demonstrated, would not need to be demonstrated again, so long as nothing resembling that original incident was ever allowed to happen a second time. The channel closed, and the human vessel remained exactly where it was, unmoving, patient, and utterly unthreatening in its stillness, even as every officer in that command post stared at their displays, with expressions I can only describe as a mixture of disbelief and something close to fear. Fleet Marshal Crail did not order another attack. I do not believe he could have found the words to justify one, even to himself, after what had just happened. Counselor Amara, when I finally spoke with her hours later, told me that the High Council had convened yet again, this time in a mood entirely different from anything that had come before. There was no more talk of demonstrating strength through numbers, no more dismissal of humanity as a young, insignificant power unworthy of serious concern. Within 2 days, the Concorde formally announced a full withdrawal of military assets from the Coran Expanse, alongside a public acknowledgement of the incident that had triggered the crisis, exactly as the human ultimatum had demanded. The announcement was framed, carefully, as a gesture of goodwill and a commitment to renewed diplomatic engagement, language chosen specifically to avoid the appearance of having been forced into compliance by a single vessel, and a calm, unhurried voice on an open channel. But everyone who had witnessed those 36 hours knew the truth, whether they said it aloud or not. The Concorde had not chosen peace because it suddenly valued honesty and accountability more than it had 3 weeks earlier. It had chosen peace because it had finally understood, in the clearest terms possible, exactly what the cost of choosing otherwise would be. The human vessel remained in the system for another full week following the Concorde's withdrawal announcement, silent and unmoving, before finally departing as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a border region that had, in the space of little more than a month, gone from a routine territorial dispute to the single most studied event in modern Concorde military history. I remained assigned to the diplomatic office for several more months after that crisis ended, and in that time, I watched the entire structure of Concorde foreign policy begin to shift beneath the weight of what had happened. New protocols were introduced for reviewing incidents involving civilian populations. Oversight committees, long treated as symbolic formalities, were given real investigative authority for the first time in generations. None of these changes happened because the Concorde's leadership had a sudden change of heart. They happened because every counselor now understood, with absolute certainty, that somewhere beyond the border, a species existed that would not simply accept quiet institutional failure as the cost of doing business, and that would answer such failure with a precision the Concorde had never before had to reckon with. I often think back to that conversation in the narrow room aboard Laura Bennett's transport, to the calm certainty in her voice, as she described a response built not around conquest or destruction, but around a single, unmistakable answer to a single, unmistakable question. I understand now what she meant when she said her people had learned that the loudest response is rarely the most effective one. The galaxy did not fear humanity because of what they were capable of building, though what they built was formidable beyond anything our intelligence had prepared us for. The galaxy feared humanity because of what they chose not to do with that capability, again and again, even when every provocation offered them ample justification to do far more. A civilization that could have destroyed 12 ships chose instead to disable 3, and then simply waited, patiently, for the rest of us to understand why that restraint was the most unsettling thing of all. I write this account now, years later, not as a warning, though perhaps it will be read as one, but as a record of the moment I finally understood something about power that my own civilization, for all its age and reach, had somehow never fully learned. True strength is not measured by what a people can do to those who cross them. It is measured by how precisely, how carefully, and how rarely they choose to use it, and by how completely that choice, once demonstrated, changes the behavior of everyone watching, for generations to come. That is the story of how peace negotiations failed, and how humanity's answer to that failure quietly, permanently reshaped the way an entire galaxy understood the meaning of consequence.